Welcome to Sexpertease. I'm your host and favorite sexpert, Erica Rivera. Standards and expectations are two things people talk about a lot in relationships, but they're often used interchangeably. And when that happens, it creates confusion about what you should actually tolerate versus what you're simply hoping for. A lot of people believe they have standards when in reality, they're operating on unspoken expectations that keep getting violated. That gap between the two is where frustration starts to build. Let's slow this down for a second because this is where a lot of relationship patterns begin. When you're not clear on what your standards actually are, you end up accepting behavior that doesn't align with what you want. At the same time, you might be expecting things from someone that you've never clearly communicated or even fully defined for yourself. That combination creates a cycle that's hard to break. In this episode, we're going to break this down in a very practical way. We're going to look at the difference between standards, expectations, and control, and how each one shows up in real relationships. Because once you understand that difference, it becomes a lot easier to recognize what's actually happening in your own situation. And more importantly, it gives you clarity on what to do next. Standards are your non negotiables. They are the things that define what is acceptable and unacceptable in your relationship, that is. And they are usually rooted in your values. So these aren't things you create based on another person, for example. They come from your understanding of what you need to feel respected, safe, and fulfilled. Standards are about you, not about controlling someone else. When your standards are clear, they create structure in your relationships. They help you recognize alignment more quickly, and they make it easier to identify when something isn't working. Without standards, everything becomes negotiable. And that's where people start to over tolerate behavior that doesn't actually meet their needs. Over time, that leads to frustration and emotional exhaustion. I want to be really clear about this. Standards aren't about being rigid or unrealistic. They're about being honest with yourself. They're about knowing what you need in order to show up fully in a relationship. And when those standards are grounded in self respect, they become a guide, not a barrier. Now, expectations, on the other hand, are often based on assumptions. They're the things you hope or believe someone will do, sometimes without ever expressing them clearly. Expectations can come from past experiences, it could come from cultural norms, or even what you've seen like in other relationships. And while they're not inherently wrong, they can easily lead to disappointment, especially when they're not aligned with reality. So, a lot of people expect their partner to just know what they need. They expect consistency, communication, or emotional support without having a clear conversation about it. And when those expectations aren't met, it feels like the other person is falling short. But in many cases, the issue is not the effort, it's clarity. This is where it gets important. Expectations need to be examined, not just assumed. Because when you rely on unspoken expectations, You're creating situations where both people are operating on different understandings. And that disconnect is what leads to frustration, confusion, and miscommunication. Control. Let's talk about it because this is where things often get mislabeled. Control is when you try to shape, change, or manage another person's behavior in order to meet your needs. It can look subtle at first, like suggesting how someone should show up, but over time it becomes an attempt to direct who they are. And that's where relationships start to lose authenticity. Let's pause here for a second because this is important. A lot of people confuse control with having standards, when in reality, they're trying to get someone to become what they want. Instead of asking, is this person aligned with me? They're asking, how can I get this person to meet my expectations? That shift in mindset creates pressure and resentment on both sides. Healthy relationships are not built on control. They're built on choice. You choose someone who already aligns with your values rather than trying to mold them into alignment. And when you understand that difference, it changes how you approach everything moving forward. So, why do people confuse standards, expectations, and control so often? And a big part of that comes down to fear. Fear of losing the relationship, fear of being alone, or fear that if they set clear standards, the other person won't meet them. That fear leads people to blur the lines instead of defining them. Let's slow this down because this is where a lot of people get stuck. When you're emotionally attached to someone, it becomes harder to be objective about what is actually happening. You start to justify behavior, minimize red flags, and adjust your expectations instead of holding your standards. And that creates internal conflict. Over time, this confusion leads to patterns that repeat. You keep hoping things will improve while lowering what you're willing to accept. And that cycle continues until you step back and create clarity. There's a difference between having low standards and having no standards at all. Low standards mean you're accepting less than what you truly want, but you still have some awareness of what's missing. No standards, on the other hand, often looks like going with the flow and avoiding any kind of conflict or discomfort. Sound familiar? We did talk about that a little bit in last week's episode. Complacency, perhaps? And let's be honest, this can feel easier in the moment. If you don't define your standards, you don't have to confront whether the relationship is meeting them. You don't have to have difficult conversations, and you don't have to make hard decisions. But that ease is absolutely temporary. Eventually, the lack of standards catches up with you. You start to feel unfulfilled, disconnected, or even resentful without fully understanding why. And that's because you never gave yourself a clear framework for what you actually need. Do you know what you need? On the other end of the spectrum, we also have unrealistic expectations, which can create just as many problems. This is where people expect perfection, constant availability, or emotional responses that aren't realistic or sustainable. It sets the relationship up for failure before it even has a chance to grow. Let's take a moment to look at this honestly. Expecting someone to meet every emotional need, always communicates perfectly, or never makes mistakes, just isn't realistic. It's not. Relationships involve two human beings. Two, not idealized versions of what we think they should be. And when expectations are too high, disappointment becomes inevitable. This doesn't mean to lower your standards, though. It means aligning your expectations with reality. It means understanding the difference between what you need and what you're projecting onto someone else. And that awareness creates healthier dynamics. So, this this connects directly to what we talked about last week and throughout April, and that's emotional safety, right? You can feel emotionally safe in a relationship and still not have alignment in standards or expectations. Safety creates comfort, but it doesn't automatically create compatibility, unfortunately. Let's slow down again for a second. Just because something feels calm or stable doesn't mean it's meeting your needs. You may not be in conflict, but you could still be experiencing a gap in effort or a gap in communication or even emotional connection. And that distinction matters. Emotional safety is the foundation. I've said that many, many times, but it's not the full structure. You still need clarity. You still need to be reciprocal, and you need to be aligned. And without those, even the safest relationship can start to feel incomplete. One of the clearest signs that you are tolerating just way too much is when you find constantly making excuses for someone's behavior. You rationalize what they're doing, hoping it will change over time. And while that may come from a place of compassion, it's going to eventually lead to an imbalance. Another sign is feeling drained, absolutely drained instead of supported. When you're putting in more effort than what you are receiving, it takes a toll on your energy. You start to feel like you're carrying the whole relationship rather than participating in it equally. And over time, these patterns repeat. You notice the same issues coming up, the same conversations happening, and the same lack of change. That repetition is your signal that something needs to shift. Now, on the flip side, expecting too much often shows up as constant disappointment. No matter what the other person does, it never feels like enough. And that's usually a sign that your expectations aren't aligned with what's realistic. Let's pause here because this requires some honesty. And for those of you that know me, I'm very honest all the time. Are you expecting someone to meet needs that you haven't clearly defined or communicated? Are you expecting consistency from someone who hasn't even demonstrated that capacity? These are important questions. When expectations are too high or unclear, it creates pressure in the relationship. And that pressure can push people away instead of bringing them closer. Awareness here allows you to recalibrate rather than react. Boundaries and standards, they often get grouped together, but they actually serve different purposes. Standards define what you require in a relationship, while boundaries define how you respond when those standards aren't met. One sets the expectation, the other sets the action. Let's slow down for the third time. For clarity, a standard might be consistent communication. All right, so that might be your standard, consistent communication. While a boundary might be choosing to step back if that communication isn't happening. They work together, but they're not the same thing. So understanding that difference is powerful because it moves you out of waiting and into action. Instead of hoping things change, you're creating a framework for how you respond. And that's where your control actually exists. Now, communicating standards doesn't have to be complicated. It really doesn't. Communication is my favorite topic on this show. You would think it would be like anatomy or maybe the physical act of sex, since it is Sexpertease after all. But communicating standards, instead of making it complicated, we need to try to make it clear. So it doesn't have to be this difficult thing, but it does need to be clear. It's not about making demands or giving ultimatums. It's about expressing what you need in a calm, direct way. Calm but direct, because you still want to get your point across. Clarity reduces confusion and sets the tone for the relationship. Timing also matters. These conversations are most effective when they happen early rather than after frustration has already built up. When you communicate from a grounded place, it's easier for the other person to understand where you're coming from. And here's the key: communication is only part of the equation. What matters just as much is how the other person responds. Because communication without change, that doesn't create alignment. When your standards aren't being met, the most important thing is to look at its behavior over time. Not promises, not potential, but consistent action. Patterns tell you far more than words ever will. Shall we pause again? Because this is where clarity comes in. If you've communicated your needs and nothing has changed, that's information. It tells you what the other person is willing or not willing to do. And at that point, the decision shifts back to you. Okay, to you. Do you continue in the same dynamic or do you make a different choice? That in itself is on you. That's where responsibility comes into play. Self-responsibility means you're owning your role in the relationship. It means recognizing when you're tolerating something that doesn't align with your standards And it means making decisions based on reality, not on hope. It's easy to focus on what the other person is or isn't doing, but your power is in how you respond. So if you decide to stay in it, you're the one who decided to stay in it. You get to decide what you accept. You get to decide what you address. You get to decide what you walk away from. This isn't about blame. It's about clarity. And the more honest you are with yourself, the easier it becomes to create relationships that actually align with what it is that you need. Standards, expectations, and boundaries all play a role in how relationships function. But the key is understanding the difference between them and how they show up in real life. Because without that clarity, it's easy to stay in patterns that just don't serve you. Healthy relationships aren't about perfection, they're about alignment. They're about choosing someone who meets you where you are while also being clear about what you need. And that clarity creates stronger, more intentional connections. If this episode resonated with you and you want to go deeper, you can support Sexpertease on Patreon or book a one-on-one session with me. I do one-on-one consultations with many of our viewers and listeners, and I'm always happy. I'm always happy to address something that might be going on in your own relationship, or even if you're navigating the single life. So stay clear, stay intentional, and as always, here on Sexpertease, we keep marriages exciting and single people safe.